back everyone to the DUO MFA course. I am Pranav, your instructor for the entire course. So last time we uh, completed and saw the scenario of DUO's different sets of policies, the global policy, how a customized policy can be formed, what are the different custom attributes which we can use in the policies, and we saw a demonstration of all those things with the Windows 10 operating system. As I told earlier, the next use case would be Duo's integration with Cisco's security product Identity Services Engine, which is popularly known as ISE. So today we'll be covering a new component for the authentication of ISE and Duo using multi-factor authentication. The new component is known as Duo Authentication Proxy. So let's get started, and first let's have a look at what these components are and the high level steps of how the configuration will be like, and later on we'll conclude it with an actual demonstration of ISE integration with Duo for multi-factor authentication. Okay, so there are four use cases when it comes to integration of ISE with DUO MFA. First is the ISE admin login, which will be our first use case. Then another popular use case is device administration, wherein the TechX feature in ISE, we'll see how ISE integrates. ISE first authenticates the devices using either the local ID store in ISE and then uses multi-factor authentication of Duo. Also, network access control, which is a very popular security feature in ISE, which depends on the radius protocol. This can be also integrated with ISE, and the guest portals can also be integrated. But for our use cases and for our learning, we'll keep it limited to two use cases. First will be ISE admin login, and second will be the device administration. Now let's have a look that what exactly the components involved are, and how exactly what exactly is the flow and what happens when we integrate Duo with ISE. So as you can see, there is a ISE admin here who has his normal username password and is trying to log into ISE. So this is the first step. So if you see in general scenario, these username password would be either present locally on ISE, or ISE would depend on the Active Directory, so that the user authentication happens on the basis of Active Directory, and then access is granted to the administrator. Correct? So if you see, oh, but in this case, if you see, there is a new component involved here, which is known as DUO Authentication Proxy. So now what exactly this authentication proxy does, let's have a look. In this use case, if you see, the ISE admin provides the username and password into the box itself. Now, instead of ISE being integrated with Active directly, what we do is, if you see this step 2, we integrate ISE with the DUO Authentication Proxy, and DUO Authentication Proxy is in turn integrated with the Active Directory for the primary authentication, which is also known as the first factor of authentication. The next stage is, once this primary authentication is successful, Active Directory returns an success message to the proxy, and based on that, proxy then proceeds with the second factor of authentication by reaching out to Duo Cloud. Now what happens in this? For this, the first requirement is the port 443 should be enabled from the perimeter firewall of the organization, so that the authentication proxy can reach out to the Duo cloud. Duo Authentication Proxy is nothing but the exe application which runs on Windows and also a .pkg package which can be run on Linux. We will see at the hardware requirements. It can be even deployed on a Windows virtual machine and needs the minimum resources. The reason for this authentication proxy is it proxies the it proxies the communication between the Active Directory and the Duo Cloud. The Active Directory doesn't talk to the Duo Cloud directly. This proxy behaves like an actual proxy and hides the identity of the Active Directory or the actual user. And on behalf of them, it authenticates with the Duo Cloud, provides the request for a second factor, and based on that, Duo Cloud sends a second factor on this user's mobile phone, and then this user, when he or she accepts, the same flow goes back to the authentication proxy, and authentication proxy is known that the Active Directory first factor was successful. Now the second factor is also successful, so it gives the administrator the login access to ISE. Now let's see how exact, what exactly are the requirements for this. Let me clear this. Okay, so if you see, the configuration components involved are in this integration. Now this is just in regards with device administrator, device administration. But if you see, first step is we configure Duo proxy as the radius token in the identity source on ISE. Then we configure the TechX policies. This is for device administration. In our case, this step will not be involved for the step 1, since we are just doing it for the admin login. Later on, this step will also not be involved for this step 2, for this specific use case. So as of now, we have to just configure this specific step and then add this radius token as the authentication mode in admin access. Second component we have is authentication proxy, which is, as I said, is a small exe file which will be installed on a Windows server or Windows operating system. It can be even a VM. There we have to configure the primary authentication source, which in our case will be the Active Directory. Then we have to add ISE IP address and the radius shared secret details so that this integration works. Later on, we have to add the application and API details which we get from the Duo Cloud. In Duo Cloud, we have to just add application to protect, which is known as Cisco ISE radius. Just click on protect and there will be 3 keys generated, same like we saw it for Microsoft RDP. And then you can configure whatever custom policies you want so that you can manage it in your own way. So these are the 3 components which are involved in this specific integration. This is a very useful use case when it comes to the actual deployment, because being a secure ISE being a security device, it can be prone to password attacks from inside of the organization. So you integrating it with DUO MFA, we can make sure that we secure it using multi-factor authentication, and we are left with no tracks, so that it is easy for the administrators. So starting with the ISE identity store configuration, as you can see, under administration, under external identity source, we have to add the DUO authentication proxy. So this is nothing but DUO proxy machine, and this will be added in this specific section of radius token. There's no need of adding active directory, but in my lab setup it was already integrated, so but it shouldn't matter, because duo proxy will be the one who will be talking with active directory, and duo proxy will be the one who will be talking with the duo cloud, and ICE will send all the requests to duo proxy. So this is how the flow will be. The next is, if you see, we have to specify the specific parameters, like after clicking on add you have to specify a name in the general tab. Later on in the connection tab you have to specify the duo proxy IP address. So this will be nothing but duo sorry duo proxy IP. There will be a shared secret. This is not the shared secret, we get it from duo cloud. This is a shared secret which will be the radius shared secret used for authentication between proxy and ICE. The authentication port will remain as 1812, since radius uses 1812 for authentication. And make sure you increase the timeout to 60, because since we will having an additional factor, reaching out to the duo cloud and getting the request on the user's smartphone for the push notification can take some seconds more, so better to keep it on a safer side. So that's the reason you have to increase this to 60. And later on you have to just change the sequence of administrators. That's it. Let's have a look of what exactly will be done in the duo admin configuration. You have to search for Cisco ISE radius and click on the protect button so that it is protected. And we have to note the integration key, secret key, and API hostname, because these three things will be used in the duo authentication proxy. So proxy is reachable via the cloud and vice versa. Then this is the policy configuration. This is just a snap from the global policy. We have already seen this part. You can either use the global policy or create a custom policy for ICE specific application, so that you go and apply it directly. This is just for maintaining a separate interface, for separate policy for ICE, separate policy for Windows if you have, or separate policy for any other applications. The custom policy, as we saw, can require, just make it a mandate to require the biometric or the touch ID, so that it can be an additional factor other than the MFA. On top of that, we also need biometrics. Now the requirements for the duo authentication proxy. If you see, the requirement for the virtual machine, or directly installing Windows on a bare metal server, anything which suits your requirement would work. There's a CPU course requirement is just one core, 4 GB of RAM, which is like very easily available in the VM environment in any organization. Disk space requirement is just 200 MB. and the operating system can be Windows Server 2012 or later, or even any Linux machine would do. Even you can install it on Microsoft Windows for test purpose. We will be also doing the same thing. We'll be installing it directly on the Windows operating system. Also, after the configuration, which we'll be discussing in the coming slides, you have to make sure that this service which is highlighted, which is DUO Security Authentication Proxy service, is in a started mode, so that it actually functions. And every time you change the configuration in DUO Authentication Proxy, it is kind of a script configuration where you just specify the parameters, which is not that complex. You have to make sure that you restart the service. We'll be seeing it in the demo part as well. Okay, so here comes the DUO Authentication Proxy. So if you see, there are multiple parameters, but we will look at the parameters which are specific for our use case. First, we have to specify the AD client. Why? Because proxy will be the one who will be carrying the credentials and authenticating it on behalf of the user with the Active Directory. You have to specify the host or the DNS resolvable host name of the Active Directory. Anything would be fine. Also, you have to specify username and password who have the privilege of lookup of the users, that is on behalf of proxy. It will, the specified username or password will have the privilege of looking up the users in the Active Directory for the first level of authentication, since auth proxy will be doing the first authentication on behalf of the user. And we have to specify a search DN or a distinguished name. Users who are, or administrators who are familiar with working with Active Directory, know what a distinguished name is. Basically, you have to specify a organization unit or a path in which all the users will be present. Make sure you give a higher level of OU or the search DN, so that you don't miss out any users. For the same purpose, I, in this example, you can see I have directly given dcloud.cisco.com, so that I don't mess up with any specific OUs and the entire directory will be accessible or searchable. The next section is radius server auto. Make sure you have to maintain the syntax and these things which are mentioned, except the parameters. The parameters after the equals to sign will change basis on your organization's network. The rest thing you have to keep it as it is, because it's the syntax of the auth proxy, and when you download this specific parameters will already be present. You have to just replace it with the organization specific parameters. In this radius server auto section, you can see the integration key, the secret key, and the API host. You have to mention this of the ISE, Cisco ISE radius application, which we noted it from the DUO cloud. Cisco ISE radius application, which we protected in the DUO cloud. The IP address of ISE. Now everything in this will be related to ISE, and everything in this section will be relating to the first factor, that is, in our case it will be AD. The shared secret which we will be entering in the ISE when creating the radius token identity source, make sure you have the same shared secret with the case sensitive characters. Client, you have to mention who will be the client for first factor. Here it will be AD client, so this AD client is mentioned as it is mentioned in this parameters, so we have to mention it this way. The port will be, since it is radius, the port will be 1812, and for fail mode will be safe. Why safe? Because in case of failure, we can bypass the proxy. in case of failure or unreachability. There is another mode known as secure, but if make sure if this is the case, you have HA of authentication proxy. In our case, we are mentioning it as safe since it's just for a demo and we have only one authentication proxy. But when deploying it in real time, you can specify it secure. Just make sure that at least one of the proxy server, DUO authentication proxy servers is reachable so that you don't, because there will be no fallback even if the authentication proxy, both the authentication proxy servers fail, the user will not be able to bypass this proxy unless and until we make it up. So make use of this very carefully. So this is the configuration which we have to do it manually on authentication proxy. Now let's check the flow diagram so that we are more clear. Now if you see, consider an example that I am the ISE admin. Now I'm considering that all the three components, which is ISE itself, DUO Authentication Proxy, and protecting ISE in the DUO Cloud application, we have done all the three configuration components. Let's assume that it is complete. We'll be seeing a demo as well, but as of now, let's just assume that we are completed the configuration and we enter this specific credentials which we have created, and the identity source will be our radius token server. I have named it as ICE. So at first, HTTPS authentication takes place, which is the regular authentication which happens irrespective of any identity source. Now, if you see, since we have specified DUO radius token here, the primary authentication, which is also known as access request in radius language, it goes to the DUO authentication proxy, and in turn DUO authentication proxy sends it to the AD, since this proxy is the one who we will be communicating with instead of directly with AD. After the primary authentication is successful, the DUO authentication proxy sends a second factor authentication to the DUO cloud on port 443, which is HTTPS and secure. So you have to make sure this port again when it is leaving the organization, since DUO cloud is on the internet, we have to make sure that on the firewall 443 is open for this specific request coming from DUO authentication proxy. On the DUO cloud, the policy check and the user lookup and any custom policy checks will be done to check what configuration is exactly done for Cisco ISE application, and if there are any other additional policies created like requiring a biometric or user coming from a specific network only can be added given access. After doing this, DUO will send a second factor on this user's mobile phone. If you see, this is me trying to log in, since I am the ISE admin trying to log in. I get this login request on my mobile on the DUO application, and I have two options, either to approve it or deny it. Now suppose I approve it because I am the only one who is actually trying to access this. No one has stolen my credentials. I want to log in for some configuration purpose. So the mobile replies back to the cloud that yes, the request is approved. So after that, DUO cloud replies that yes, the second factor is successful. On basis of that, DUO authentication proxy now knows that both the factors are complete. It gives the access accept in return to this access request, which we saw earlier as the first request. The radius token response will be access accept. and the final output will be ISE will give a access accept to the user, and then the user will be successfully able to log in to the ISE GUI. This will be the flow, the actual flow, the steps which will take place during the authentication flow. The reason why I'm showing this flow is because when we actually integrate these specific applications together, we will not even come to know that this actual flow exists, because it will be within quick seconds. We'll not even be able to figure out how exactly the flow is. That's the reason we are discussing this flow. And it will look somewhat like this. I've just taken a snap from when I was doing the lab, setting up the lab for you guys. You can see we get a approve and deny request. When I approve, we will be able to access ISE. Demo. Now comes the interesting part. So let's start working on the demo to configure it. So for that, what I've did is in applications, the first step, what I've did is, what we can do is I've just jotted down some steps, the high level steps in my notepad, so that we are clear and it's easy to remember, so that we don't miss out, because since there are many steps involved and there are 3 configuration components involved, it becomes difficult to track down what exactly has been completed and what exactly is pending. So that's the reason we better to follow these steps. You can prepare your own, or if you memorize, that would also be fine. So the first thing which we have to do is add ISE in Duo, which is protect ISE in Duo Cloud. So what we have to do is just click on protect an application and search for Cisco ISE, or you can directly search for ISE and you will be able to see Cisco ISE radius. Protection type will be two-factor authentication. Just click on this protect button. Since I already have it, what I'll do is I'll just show you. These are the integration key, secret key, and the API host name, which will be auto generated, and we have to use this and specify it in the authentication proxy. So authentication proxy is able to communicate with Duo Cloud, my specific instance, my specific account, or account of my organizations with this ID. And on top of that, we have 2 different secret keys for the secure authentication. As of now, the global policy is applied. I have not yet created any policy, any specific custom policy, because we already saw how a custom policy is created, and the only output we intend to see is a successful two-factor authentication when logging into ISE. Custom policies we have already dealt it with in the earlier use case of Windows 10. So now we have this keys. I've already noted it down, so I will mention this step as complete so that I have a track. Second is download and configure Duo proxy on the workstation / Windows Server. For that, you can just go on to this link, duo.com/docs, which is docs/authproxy-reference. And if you see new proxy install, there is a link here to download the Duo Authentication Proxy. This version currently is 5.4 and it keeps on updating, and the updated files link is available here. So what you have to do is just copy the address and download it on the specific server. Now in my case, what I'll be doing is I'll be using a workstation. As I've mentioned, I've already downloaded the specific exe file of the proxy. It is of 28 MB approximately. Using this link only I've downloaded it, and I'll be using the same machine to access ISE or to test ISE, so that it is easy for me, and it can I have to just do the configuration on one specific server, since this is just a test. But in real time, you have it is better to keep it separate, the user machine to be separate and the administrator machine to be separate, so that duo proxy is deployed in a different environment and it has a separate machine assigned for itself. So if one goes down, we still have the access to ISE. So after installing, there will be, if you check the C drive, the program files, the x86, the program files, will be a duo security authentication proxy folder present after the successful installation. The installation asks for no parameters. You have to just click on next and install it. Just go to this configuration file, make sure you have sufficient privileges to enter this folder. If you can see, there is a lock icon which specifies that it needs escalation of privileges, and open this authproxy.configuration or the .cfg file with notepad, because .cfg, the Windows machine will not identify the extension. So open it with a notepad, and as we saw, first thing, IP address of the Active Directory. I have my Active Directory here. If you see, the IP address is 198.168.1.133.1. The service account username is administrator and the password I've mentioned it. You can use any service account which has the privilege of search DN, which has the ability to search for the users for the primary authentication. To keep it simple, I have directly used the super admin credentials of the Active Directory so that I have access to the entire Active Directory. And the search DN will be directly the root DN. We can check it out here. Just 1 minute. If you see, just go on the properties of dcloud.cisco.com, go into the object or attribute editor, and if you scroll down, the distinguished name, you can just view and copy it. I've did the same thing. So this completes the AD client or the parameters for the AD required for the first factor of authentication. Next step would be enter the parameters for radius server, which will be ICE in this case. So we have mentioned the integration key, the secret key, the API host, which is visible here. If you take ends with MOM, ends with MOM0M, I've already populated these fields for ease. Radius IP1 will be the ICE IP address. So if you go and check the IP address, I'll quickly show it to you guys. Remember, we need IP address of the admin persona if you have different personas of ICE. For me, it was just a single node or a standalone. I've used this IP address 133.27. So I have proxy on the same machine 127. The radius shared secret will be proxy at 123. You can keep anything which you think is more secure. The client, I've called this AD client here. Port will be 1812, radius authentication port, and the fail mode will be safe. Once this configuration is complete, you can just open the services by directly searching for the program services or going to services.msc. And if you see, there is a DUO security authentication proxy. You have to start it. For my case, I have already installed it, so I'll just restart it. Here's the option. At the first time, this will be enabled since you have just installed the proxy. Any changes we do in the proxy file, the authproxy.cfg file, we have to make sure we restart the service. Let's check the tracker. We have completed this step. We have completed this step as well. Now we have to create a user in AD and the specific search DN. Make sure the search DN which we are specifying here, here has that user under this OU or directly the root DN so that you don't miss the user. In my case, I have created this user Pranav N. Oops. So this step is complete as well. Now comes the crucial step of adding DUO as the authentication source in the form of radius token in identity services engine. So let's quickly go to administration, external identity sources, radius token, and I'll click on add. I'll name it as DUO, mention it as DUO MFA. I can either submit it now itself or I can add this connection thing. Now for me, I don't have a secondary server for DUO authentication proxy. If you have, you can just enable this option and make sure this radio box is checked. Always access primary server first. Now I'll specify the authentication proxy details here. So the host IP will be my machine IP, which is this machine itself, which is 198.133.36. The shared secret will be proxy at 123, since we saw. Just verify it. We'll verify it once again. Yep. This authentication port will be 1812, and as I said earlier, we have to make sure that we increase the timeout at least to 30 for safer side, or testing I'll keep it to 60 because there's a additional authentication step. 5 seconds would be too less because once the primary authentication is succeeded, for the secondary authentication, for the authentication proxy to reach the cloud, then the cloud would reach the user's second factor. It takes time, so better to add keep this timing as more so that we don't end up in those issues and we have nothing to do with the connection attempts. So we can just keep it to default and submit this. Perfect. So we have the radius token created for authentication proxy. So yes, this step is complete too. We are near the end of where we'll be the testing. Now I have to make sure that I add this user in identities and then add this as the admin user and keep it as external user since I have it created already on the Active Directory. If you are using ISE Identity Store, there's a different configuration which we'll be discussing later. So I'll quickly go into identities. I'll create a user. Now there are two options as we discussed last time. If you check in the users, I have a username Pranav space n and I have created an alias of Pranav n without a space, and the user which I've created in AD is matches this specific username. So you can add up to 8 alias. I don't need to change the username because I'm using this username for my Windows authentication. I'm using this alias of my name for ISE authentication, so that should work perfectly. Make sure I mention it as it is. Status would be enabled and the password type would be DUO, which will be external. Yes, I've submitted it. Now this part is done till identities, but I have to add it still as the admin user in ISE admin access. So what I can do is I can go to the admin access section, administrators, admin users, just click on add, and since I've already created the user, to just select the select from network access users and select the user. So it is asking for an email address, but it's not mandatory, and make sure this option is already checked by default. Will not be able to edit it, that this is an external user. So if you see, note, since we are creating which we will be used for authorization only, we don't require password field since the authentication will be done by someone else, which is DUO proxy in our case. I can just specify my name here, which would be Pranav, and admin groups. I want this to be a super admin, and I'll click on save so that my user is created. So this completes the step 6. The last thing which I have to do is change the source of administrator login to DUO proxy, which is specified as internal users by default. So let's go to the authentication part within admin access, since we are dealing with the administrator access of ISE or the ISE login. And in this identity source, I have to mention this as radius duo, which is the radius token server which we created a few steps before. And I'll click on save. Anyways, when logging into ISE, we get the option of selecting this identity source, but we get the option only when we select some other identity source other than the internal users. So we are complete with this step as well. And that's the final is to test what exactly happens when we test this. So I'll quickly log out of this admin. What I will do is I will minimize this. I will mirror my phone so that you get to see. So I have my phone mirrored here. So let's go ahead and enter the credentials created on Active Directory for the primary authentication. I've already populated, and make sure to select the identity source as DUO and click on login. If you see, I've got this request, which means the reachability is working. Cisco ISE Radius is the application name. I click on approve and boom, we are logged in. If you see, we logged in with a user created on AD, which was my first factor. So if we go back to the flow diagram, you can see that the primary request was served by proxy, which is in return integrated with the AD. It sent the secondary authentication request to Duo Cloud, and after that it sent me a notification for push notification on my mobile, which I accepted, and then it replied with a success in all these three steps and I got access. If we want to verify it on more detailed view, what we can do is just go to this is a part of troubleshooting for which we'll be having the last session later on. The last session will be for troubleshooting this, but still we can just have a look at it. If we open this authproxy.log or log file, you can see each and every step which happens is logged here. So if you see, we received a new request from 133.27, which is our ISE, the credentials, and the login name or the username. Now, as per the configuration which we have created in this proxy file, if you see, the client we are using is AD client, and the AD IP address or the host name or the resolvable name is 133.1. So if you see this log file, it is specifying that sending the AD authentication request for this specific username to this host name or server, which is AD in our case. So these are some of the processes which start in the backend, and after that, after getting a successful request, you can see it is trying to post the request to the API of Duo Cloud, which we have specified it here. API ending with 5c.duosecurity.com, ending with 5c.duosecurity.com. After that, you can see these are some factory steps which happen in between, and after that, when I clicked on approve, it is specifying in this step that DUO authentication return allow, which means success, and then logging you inside the application. So it is returning the response code in Radius language, which we call it as access accept. You can see it here as we discussed, sending an access accept. So the same thing happened here, and it has sent the response, which is this step. And on top of that, Duo proxy sends access accept and the last step, so that I get access to the identity services engine, the admin portal. So this is how you can troubleshoot each and every step, whether it is working as intended or it is giving any error. If the AD is not reachable from the proxy, there might be many connectivity point of view, reachability point of view, many factors which would impact this. Let's try to change or create a custom policy just for a single custom policy testing, so that we know that it works perfectly. What I'll do is I'll go on policies. I have this policy for Windows. I'll create a new policy for Cisco ISE. I'll keep everything to default. I just want the biometrics to be enabled. which is my favorite custom policy because it adds extra layer. I don't want anything else, so I'll just create this policy. So if you see, this is Cisco ISE mobile device biometrics. So what I will do is go into applications, Cisco ISE radius, and in the policy, apply a policy. In this I'll select Cisco ISE, apply, and click on save. The application has been modified successfully. Let's test it out if I require any specific additional authentication factor now when I'm logging into ISE. So we know it well if it works. Okay, these are my credentials. I'll quickly minimize this. Click on login. Got a request on my phone. Can see a biometrics button is enabled, which means my custom policy is in effect. Entering my touch ID with my fingerprint, and yes, I'm logged in. So this proves that the custom policy is also in effect, as we created it just right away for the mobile device biometrics, which requires a additional biometric verification on top of approving it, wherein I provided my biometrics to my mobile and then it successfully logged me in. So this completes the use case of ISE admin login, which was obviously it was successful. And we can get the same level of access because I've created this user as a super admin. You can get the logs from the reporting section, wherein you can use it for audit that which specific authentication source was used for the ISE login. You can find out the reports and operations report section, and in reports you can, in the audit section, you can find out the administrator login. You can see the administrator name is given here, which we use Pranav N. The IP address, which is .36, which is the machine's IP. If you see it here, which is the machine's IP, the same machine, because proxy is the source and not the active directory, because the first factor is handled by DUO proxy rather than the direct active directory. You can see that administrator authentication happened successfully. Later on, administrator logged off. Then again, the administrator authentication is successful. Now, when I log off or log out of this user and then try to log in again, there will be an administrator logged off and the administrator authentication visible again. So you can export this specific report so that whenever there's an audit in your organization, you have the audit that who logged in using which specific device, and in the audit you can also tell that you have used an additional factor for supporting the Cisco ISE authentication, the admin authentication. So even if the primary credentials are stolen, still the intruder or the internal threat would not get access to this, because we have the DUO authentication enabled on our smartphone as a second factor. So this concludes this specific use case. In the second use case, we will be dealing with this device administration use case wherein we will see you how we can use Duo for securing the TechAX login to the switch as well as the wireless controller. So one scenario is will cover the CLI access, which is the switch, and the second one covers the GUI access, which is the wireless controller. Wireless controller can also be integrated with its CLI, but since most of the time we log into the GUI of wireless controller to manage the access points, so we will see with that specific use case. This will be a continuation of this Duo integration with identity services engine. I hope you learned something new from this use case. You can try it as well. And we saw how Cisco products are well integrated with each other and how easy it is to integrate Cisco's products with Duo multi-factor authentication. Thank you very much, and I hope you like this session. Hope to meet you soon in the next use case.